Good morning. It is certainly wonderful to see you this morning. I'm glad that this is where you have chosen to be. The Lord has blessed us with a beautiful day to be able to assemble here, those of like precious faith, to worship Him in spirit and truth. And even if it wasn't a beautiful day outside weather-wise, it would still be a beautiful day because we have the opportunity to be here together. If you have your Bibles, be opening up to John chapter number 14. That's where we're going to begin our sermon this morning. We really probably won't spend a whole lot of time here, but that's where we're at least going to start. We've been talking about the God in which we serve and how He is a consistent God. And we spent a lot of time on that to really get to this part of the lesson where we've been looking at the fact that since God is a consistent God, He therefore demands consistency from me and you. And last week we looked at the idea that we needed to be consistent in our faith. Now, this morning's lesson is somewhat similar and would certainly be accompanied to our faith, but we're going to look at it this morning that God demands us to be consistent in our obedience. We must be obedient in everything that we do. A matter of fact, at some point this morning, we're going to look at Genesis chapter number 6 and in verse number 22 and talking about Noah. Thus Noah did all that the Lord commanded him, so he did. Now that's, of course, in reference to the construction of the ark. You remember that God had planned to destroy the world. God did destroy the world with water. And He had told Noah, Noah, you have found grace in my sight. You are a man that walks with God. So here is the ark. Here is the vessel that I want you to build, that I want you to construct. And if you remember there in Genesis chapter number 6, there's the blueprint for that ark. The length of it, the width of it, the height of it, the window, the door, pitch it inside and outside, make it with gopher wood. And what did Noah do? He did all that the Lord commanded him. He was consistent in his obedience. And we're going to talk about Noah a little bit more and kind of did through all the Noah stuff, but we'll come back and we'll refresh on Noah. But the point is, and we say this all the time, what if Noah would have been looking at those blueprints and he just picked something? Well, you know, God, this is a big, big boat. I just don't think one window is going to cut it. We're going to have to put some more windows in here. What do we say about the ark? That it would have sunk like a rock. Noah's ark, in which he built, was able to float for one reason and one reason alone. Because it was the blueprint of God that Noah followed. And so when we talk about you and I as being children of God, when we talk about you and I as being Christians, understand that we have to be obedient in everything in which we do. Note the words of Jesus there in John chapter number 14 and in verse number 15, a passage that I know that you could probably quote, but Jesus in John chapter 14 and verse number 15 would say, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." If you go one chapter over to John chapter number 15 and look at verse number 14, Jesus there would say, "Ye are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." Understand our relationship with God, our love for God, how it's demonstrated, is directly connected to our obedience to Him, to our consistent obedience to Him. I cannot say that I love God if I'm not obedient to Him. I cannot say that I love God if I'm only obedient to Him when it suits me. I cannot say that I love God if I'm not obedient to Him every day. Maybe I just want to be obedient on Sunday mornings. Maybe I just want to be obedient on Wednesday nights. Maybe it's even less than that. I cannot say that I love God if that's my attitude. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at the idea of a consistent obedience. And what we're going to do, I have 3 points for your consideration this morning to help us better understand what it means to have a consistent obedience. Point number 1, consistent obedience means obeying at all times. Point number 2, consistent obedience means obeying completely. Point number 3, consistent obedience means obeying even under pressure. So we're going to look at those 3 thoughts this morning in regards to our consistent obedience. Point number 1, consistent obedience means that I am going to obey God at all times. Turn over your New Testament to the book of Philippians chapter number 2. I want you to notice something that the Apostle Paul would write to the Philippians there in Philippians chapter number 2, and I want you to notice verse number 12. Philippians chapter number 2, look at verse number 12. It says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but how much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." So as Paul here is writing to the church at Thessalonica, the very first thing that he praises them for, he says, I am thankful that you are, now note the word that he uses, always obedient. And then he even goes on to say, not only are you always obedient when I am there, but Paul says, I hear that you're always obedient even when I'm away. Now, since we read the verse, I don't want this, our lesson doesn't have anything to do with this, but I think it's important that we touch this. The end of that verse really quickly, when it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. A lot of people want to misuse that part of that verse. They want to say, oh, God has made it to where I can be saved in any old way, and I just have to work it out. That's not what that verse is teaching. That verse is teaching, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling as you study this word. Because here's the thing, if we don't work out our own salvation, if we don't determine what God wants us to do, what awaits us? A devil's hell. That's what Jesus said. But consistent obedience. Paul is thankful. He says, my beloved, as you have always obeyed. That means the Philippians, they were not obeying when life was simply just easy. They were not obeying when life was convenient to them. They were not obedient only when it benefited them. They were not obedient only when others were watching them. Because Paul even makes mention, you were obedient when I was absent. That means when I'm at home by myself behind closed doors, what am I doing? I'm being obedient to the law of God. Now, we're going to talk about how much of the law of God here in just a moment. But understand what he's talking about. At all times, no matter what am I striving to do? Do everything that God has told me to do. That means the way I worship, I'm striving to do it the way that God tells me to do every time. The way that I live. That means the relationship in which I am. Am I married? Am I treating my spouse the way that I should be, the way that God would have me to treat her all the time? If I'm not married, am I in a living situation that God would be pleased with? Not just some of the time, but all the time. When I'm at work, do I conduct myself in a way that is pleasing and acceptable to God? Not just some of the time, but all the time. Notice that's what Paul is admiring those in Thessalonica about. That the Philippians here, they were faithful to God. They were obedient to God no matter what. You go back in that same book to Philippians chapter number 1. And you look at verse number 5. And look at verse number 6. Now notice what the text says. It says, for your fellowship is in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. Now what I want you to hold in on is it says your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. So they had fellowship in the gospel of Christ. That means they were obedient in the gospel of Christ from when? From the first day until now. Paul is saying that these brethren at Thessalonica, they are obedient. And when are they obedient? They were obedient to God all the time. Go back to our illustration of Noah in Genesis chapter number 6. That's how we opened up, right? Go to Genesis chapter number 6 really quickly. I want to show you that Noah, his circumstances did not change the type of man in which Noah was. You read in Genesis chapter number 6 and in verse number 5 how God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's the area in which Noah lived in. Do you think it would have been easy for Noah to say, everyone else, they're not being obedient to God. They're not doing what God would want them to do. Why don't I just join them? But we read in passages such as verse number 8 and verse number 9 that Noah had found grace in the eyes of the Lord, that he was a just man. He was perfect in his generation. He walked with God. We might say it this way. In the midst of that crooked and perverse generation, Noah was a man clothed in obedience. Noah was a man that said, no matter what God says, no matter what it is, Noah says, I'm going to do it. And we noted verse number 22. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so he did. Look at verse number 5 of that next chapter, Genesis chapter 7, verse number 5. You see the very same thing. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Now, when we say that Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him, understand that goes from building the ark. That goes, Peter would call Noah, you remember, a preacher of righteousness. So while Noah is building the ark, what else is Noah doing? He's out there telling them, hey, God's going to destroy the world. Will you change your life? Noah was obedient in the preaching aspect of what he was to do. Noah was obedient in the fact when it came to getting the animals, we talk about the animals went in 2 by 2. But if you read there in Genesis chapter number 7 of the clean animals, what did they have? They had 7 of each clean animal. And Noah was obedient in all of these things. Think about it. Noah was obedient when no one else was. Noah was obedient for years without ever giving up, without ever quitting. We estimate that it took Noah anywhere from 100 to 120 years to build that ark. Could you imagine year 119? You've been laboring on this thing for what seems like a lifetime. Try to think about it in ways that we would understand. How many splinters do you think Noah got? How many times do you think maybe he smashed his finger or something with that old hammer? And it's like, man, is this really worth it? But despite all those things, what was Noah willing to do? He was willing to do everything that God had said to do. What about this? Noah obeyed before there was any evidence of rain. Noah obeyed a command that may have not made any sense. God tells Noah, Noah, you're going to build an ark because I'm going to cause it to rain. You go back to Genesis chapter number 5, And it says God watered the earth with a mist. There's no indication of rain. The Bible never talks about rain until God opens up the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven. And yet Noah was obedient. Go over to Hebrews chapter 11. Because the Hebrew writer, I think, gives us some insight into this very thing. Hebrews chapter number 11. And look at verse number 7. Hebrews chapter number 11. Note what the Hebrew writer, we call this that great hall of faith sometimes. And as the Hebrew writer is showing what these men did by faith, notice what he says about Noah in Hebrews chapter number 11 and verse number 7. By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet. So Noah was told by God, Noah, you're going to see something that has never been seen before. Noah, you're going to experience something that has never happened before. Noah, do you believe it? Noah, are you going to obey it? And the answer is yes. Because it says he moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by which he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness, which is by faith. Sometimes we may obey something that God tells us that maybe initially doesn't make sense. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. And to me, now this is just the way my mind works. Maybe your mind doesn't work this way, but this is the example that I thought of. Think about baptism, right? Picture yourself for just a moment. You don't know anything about God. You don't know anything about the Bible, and you're trying to figure things out. You're studying, maybe you're studying with somebody, and you come to a passage that says, in order to be saved, you need to be baptized. You need to be immersed in water. And you might start thinking to yourself, well, what is going down in this water down here? What is this going to do for me? But God says that's what you need to do. And I think about, because he even explains that, right? You go over to 1 Peter chapter number 3. Notice what Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter number 3. Because we may have questions. We may not completely understand it, but God tells me to do it. And so therefore I should do it. But you think about 1 Peter chapter number 3. And you look specifically at verse number 21. It says, the like figure whereunto even baptism does also now save us. And then notice Peter adds that parenthetical statement for us. The Holy Spirit adds this parenthetical statement for us. Not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so Peter is saying, the Holy Spirit is saying, listen, when you go down to that watery grave of baptism, you're not going down there to take a bath. In other words, when you come up, you're not going to be able to look down in there and go, oh, there's my sin. It's not there. But I'm obeying God. And this is why I say it ties into what we talked about last week. Because I'm putting my trust and my faith in God as I'm obeying God, that God is going to do what he promised to do. Are you going to obey God? Are you going to believe that in God when he says that if you go down into this watery grave of baptism, I'm going to wash your sins away? Do you believe that? Do you have enough obedient bone in your body, if you will, to go through with that? See, when we talk about consistently being obedient, it means I obey at all times. Even when being obedient isn't easy. Even when people aren't watching. Even if it doesn't benefit me. Sometimes mankind, they just want to do things that's only good for them. And if it's not good for them, they're not going to waste their time doing it. But God says we need to be obedient at all times. Now here's the other part of that, right? As we get into point number 2. Consistent obedience means obeying completely. You're there in 1 Peter. Let's take a quick look over at something James would say, just one book previous. Go to James chapter number 1. And let's just pick up in verse number 21. James chapter number 1, read with me starting there in verse number 21. It says, wherefore lay apart all filthiness or superfluity of naughtiness. That just means an overabundance. And receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your soul. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deeds. Here James is talking about how we need to be doers of the word. We need to be doers of all the words of God. Question. If you were to go back to John chapter number 14 and verse number 15 where we began, where Jesus there is speaking and he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Question, what commandments is Jesus talking about? Is he talking about the commandments that excite us? Is he talking about the commandments that we readily agree with? Well, of course he's talking about those. But he's talking about the commandments that maybe we were doing these things, and now if I'm going to keep all his commandments, I have to stop doing these things. When Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments, he's saying, if you love me, keep every single one of my commandments. Keep them all. Every single commandment that you could think of, any single commandment and statutes and ordinance that we read within the New Testament, here it is. God is saying, if you love me, you're going to keep all my words. God does not call us to partial obedience. We cannot obey the commands that we like and ignore the ones that we don't. We cannot keep the commands that we perceive to be easy and ignore the ones that we perceive to be hard. You know, there's a great example of this in the Old Testament of an individual that did this. Go with me back in your Old Testament to the book of 1 Samuel. You'll remember as we're turning over to 1 Samuel, and we're going to find ourselves in chapter number 15. You'll remember that first king of the United Kingdom, a man by the name of Saul. And if you know anything about Saul, Saul was kind of a hothead. Saul kind of beat to the tune of his own drum, and he tried to be faithful to God. He would be faithful to God when it was convenient to him. He would be faithful to God when it was easy to him. But if there was something that he liked or something of God's law that didn't fit into his way, Saul would just do whatever he wanted to do. And in 1 Samuel chapter number 15, we have a great example of this. Read with me there in 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we won't read the whole chapter, but we're going to do some reading in various spots of this chapter to kind of give us a summary of what was going on. But starting in verse number 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 15, it says, Samuel also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. You see what Samuel's saying to Saul? Saul, God made you king. Now it's time for you to obey. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both men and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. God tells Saul, Saul, I want you to go to the Amalekites, because I remember what they did. And Saul, when you get to the Amalekites, he says, I want you to utterly destroy them. You're not going to leave a man alive. You're not going to leave a woman alive. You're not going to leave a child alive. You're not going to leave a baby alive. You're not going to leave any animal alive. Saul, when you're done with Amalek, it needs to be a ghost town. There not need to be anybody left. There not need to be any animal that is left. Now that's the command that God gave to Saul. So you keep on reading. Saul gathered the people together and numbered them 200,000 footmen, 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said unto the Kenites, Go, depart from you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For ye showed kindness to all the children of Israel when you came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. Now look at verse number 8. And he took Agag, the king of Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and the fatlings, and of the lambs, and of all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse they destroyed utterly. You see what Saul did? Saul said, I was commanded by God to destroy everything. And here's where it gets with God, with people sometimes, with God's commands. Saul goes in, and he's going to start killing everybody. But here's the king. Well, I might be able to do something with this king. I mean, he's the king of another nation, so let me spare him. And then you go on down, it's like, well, all the very best of the animals, we got a lot of people in Israel. We could use some of these animals to eat. He'll even say later, you remember, we'll get to it. He's going to talk to Samuel. He said, we could even use some of these animals to sacrifice to God. What did God want done with those animals? He wanted them killed. And Saul says, we can do that. But you know what I always find very interesting? You get down to the verse number 9, and it says, but everything that was vile and refuse they utterly destroyed. So Saul says, let's keep the good stuff. Surely God doesn't want us to get rid of the good stuff. But if it's already bad, if it's already unclean, if it's already unsavory, we'll go ahead and destroy that. As God told us to do. Now, as you continue reading there, God's going to repent of the fact that he ever made Saul king. And so he tells Samuel, you need to go and you need to talk to Saul. Now look at verse number 13. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. The gall of Saul. Here comes Samuel, that man of God. Saul says, hey, how you doing, Samuel? I did everything that God told me to do. I love verse number 14. And Samuel said, What meaneth this then? The bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen, which I hear. And Samuel's like, wait a minute. Saul, if you actually did what you said you were supposed to do, why do I hear these sheep? Why do I hear these oxen, Saul? You didn't do what you were supposed to do. And then Saul starts to make excuses. He starts to try and justify why he did or did not do things. And he blames them on the people. A matter of fact, you get down to verse number 21. It says, But the people took the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the chief of things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord thy God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, now note verse number 22 and following, especially verse 22 and 23. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in, here it is, obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Do you see what Samuel said? Samuel said, Saul, you may have good intentions of why you didn't obey the Lord. But the one thing that the Lord desires over everything else is obedience. And here's why. Because if we will obey the Lord, then everything else falls naturally into place. Think about it. Think about just worship, right? If we obey God, then naturally our worship will be pleasing and acceptable to Him. If we obey God in regards to our home lives, as being a parent, as being children, as being a husband, as being a wife, then guess what? The home will naturally fall into its proper place by simply obeying God. And you can apply that to any element of your life. If you will obey God in it, then naturally, everything will fall into place. I remember times in my life where I was not obedient to God, and man, those times in my life, sometimes they were hard. Life got a whole lot easier when I said, okay, God, let's do things your way. And life becomes a whole lot easier. See, partial obedience is still disobedient. This was the very case for Saul. And you know, it's true for us as well. Look over at the book of Revelation. I want you to notice the words of Jesus twice within this book, something that he says that I think is worthy of our consideration. The first one is found in Revelation chapter number 1 and in verse number 3. Revelation chapter number 1, verse number 3, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the times ahead. There is a blessing for those that obey the word of the Lord. In that same book, Revelation chapter number 22, and in verse number 7. Revelation chapter number 22 and verse number 7, behold, I come quickly. Blessed is he that keepeth the sayings of the prophecy of this book. There is a blessing for true and faithful obedience. So when we look at consistent obedience, it means obeying at all times. When we look at consistent obedience, it means obeying completely. And point number 3, consistent obedience means obeying even under pressure. In other words, when times get really hard. I'm mindful of the apostles in Acts chapter number 5. Passage that I know you're familiar with, Acts chapter number 5. And I want to start reading in verse number 25. Acts chapter number 5, start reading with me there in verse number 25. Then came one and told them, saying, behold, the men whom ye put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. And they then went the captain with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should have been stoned. For when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not straitly command you that you should not teach in the name? And behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Now note verse 29. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. How easy would it have been for Peter and John and the other apostles, after seeing what these very individuals did to Jesus, how easy would it have been to say, no, I'm not doing that. How easy would it have been for the Apostle Paul? You remember him and Barnabas on that first missionary journey. There they come into the area of Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, and the people at first say, oh, these are the gods come down. And they fell down and they start worshiping Paul. They start worshiping Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas said, no, don't do that. And then what did those same people turn around and do? They turned around and they stoned Paul. And you know why they quit throwing rocks at him? Because they thought he was dead. Thought he was dead. And Paul gets up and he goes, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not obeying God anymore for this. No, that's not what he did. He got up, he went right back into the city. And he continued to preach. He continued to be obedient. He was obedient to God even when there was pressure, even when it was hard. And you know, sometimes when we talk about being obedient, children, our young, listen to this. There's going to be pressure from your friends not to obey God. There's going to be pressure when you get a job not to obey God. But if we're going to be consistently obedient, even when our friends urge us not to obey God, even when our employer may encourage us not to obey God, I have to say, I can find other friends. I have to be willing to say, I can find another job. Because God always must be obeyed. I think about 3 men from the book of Daniel. And I love their response. Go with me to the book of Daniel. We'll be in Daniel chapter number 3. Talking about 3 men, the Hebrew name, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their Babylonian names, which they're more well remembered by, although you should remember them by their Hebrew names. Their Babylonian names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But you remember in Daniel chapter number 3, and I'll just kind of sum this up because we don't have time to read it. You remember in Daniel chapter number 3 that King Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the world, the known world at that time, he's a bit of a prideful fellow. If you want this Bible student's opinion, I believe chapter number 3 is directly related to chapter number 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has this big dream of this big statue, and he's the gold statue, the gold part of the statue. And then in chapter number 3, he builds a 90-foot gold statue. And he commands, he gives the decree, he calls everybody to the plains of Dura, and he says, listen, we're gonna play some music, if you will. We're going to have all the instruments playing. And he says, I just have a simple command. He says, when you hear the music, King Nebuchadnezzar said, all I ask that you do is fall down on your knees and worship this golden image. Some commentators, and I tend to agree with them, think that the statue was probably a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but you just look at the type of person Nebuchadnezzar was, it makes sense. So you fall down, you worship this statue. So they get everybody there. The band fires up. They play some music. And you can just imagine the people in this plain falling down and worshiping this idol. But there's 3 men. Now, while everyone is down on their knees, everyone's down on their face, there are 3 men that are standing tall. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And there are some people that see this because apparently they didn't fall down correctly because they're looking up when they shouldn't have been looking up. They should have been looking at the statue. Anyway, they see Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they go, there's those Hebrew boys. We got to do something about these Hebrew boys, because you remember at the end of chapter number 1 that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, along with Daniel, they were found 10 times better than any of the other wise men that were in the land. So they were in a position of power. And so these men go to King Nebuchadnezzar and they say, oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, don't you know that if anybody didn't fall down and worship this image, they were going to be thrown into the fiery furnace? And the king says, of course I remember. I made that decree. And they said, well, don't you know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Don't you know that they didn't fall down? They didn't worship for you. If you read and study about King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a man that had a fuse about this long. He got mad really quickly, and boy, when he got mad, he did some heinous things. Go read what he did to, I forgot the king's name. Isn't that terrible? Anyway, one of the kings of Judah, go read what I'll find his name. It's right here in my head. I just can't get it out. Jehoiakim, it's one of the Jehovah's. I can't remember now. Zechariah. I don't know. Anyway, I don't remember. But he did some terrible things because he was mad. And so he gets mad. He brings Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah before him. He says, listen, is it true that you guys didn't bow down? They said, yeah, we didn't bow down. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he's kind of cooled off at this time. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you boys. I'm going to have the band play some music. And he says, if you fall down and you worship the image this second time around, then Nebuchadnezzar says, then everything's going to be okay. But he says, if you don't, understand, I'm going to take you at that instant and I'm going to throw you into a burning, fiery furnace. Now, when we talk about obedience under pressure, I want you to note Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's response to the king, starting there in Daniel chapter number 3 and in verse number 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Now, the idea of we are not careful to answer thee is literally we have no need to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. You want to talk about obedience under pressure? Do you see what these three men just did? They just told the leader of the known world, we don't even have to think about answering you. If you throw us into the burning fiery furnace, they're like, we believe that our God will save us. And then they say something truly amazing. But even if he doesn't save us, we will not be disobedient to him. Their life literally hung in the balance. You know, we read Daniel chapter number 3, and we know that God saved them. They believed with all their heart that God would save them, but they didn't know that. And they went through the fire anyway. Sometimes when we talk about being consistently obedient to God, understand it means being obedient to God when it's hard. You know, each and every one of us in this room, we have been blessed to live in this country where we have enjoyed freedom of religion. But freedom of religion exists in this country. It doesn't exist in countries around the world. We have brothers and sisters in Christ in other countries that face persecution, that face even death, because they call themselves a Christian, because they want to do what's right. And you never know. We may find ourselves in a situation similar to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, where we have to discredit God or die. The question becomes, what would you do? See, consistent obedience says yes to God before I even know the result. Think about Revelation chapter 2 and verse number 10 as we bring this lesson to a close. He's talking about faithfulness in the context, but understand obedience would be true as well. Revelation chapter number 2 and verse number 10, he says, Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Will you allow me to change that word for just a moment? Be thou obedient unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. We need to be consistent in our obedience to God. We may not know what would happen to us in times of persecution, but we must obey anyway if those times come. I want to end our lesson where we began. In John chapter 14, verse number 15. You don't have to turn over there. But remember the words of Jesus there. He said, If you love me, keep my commandments. I have a question for you this morning. Do you love Jesus? Do you love God? Do you love him all the time? Do you love him some of the time? Do you love him only when it's convenient? Sometimes we look at love and obedience as two different things. But in reality, they are directly connected to one another. If you want to be consistent in your love for God, you must be consistent in your obedience to God. By being consistent in your obedience to God, you will by default be consistent in your love for Him. Are you obedient this morning? Will you be obedient this morning if you have the need? We want to make sure that we extend unto you the Lord's invitation. So if you're here this morning and you're subject to that invitation, whether it be for prayers of the church or whether it be for baptism, we encourage you, we beg you, come as together we stand and we sing.